All right, let's jump into another deep dive. Today, we're looking at, this really interesting situation in Mali.
Okay.
They just officially dropped French as their national language.
Really?
Yeah, and it's huge. I mean, 96% of Malians voted yes to this new constitution.
Wow.
That's a big change, right? So we're talking about a massive shift, cultural, political.
Right.
And we've got all sorts of things to dig into, reports, analyses, and even some stuff about how this compares to things happening elsewhere in Africa. So let's get into it.
It's pretty amazing, While a lot of countries are struggling to hang on to their different languages, Mali just went and did this, full on.
It does make you wonder, what led to such a huge vote, right? I mean, French didn't just disappear overnight.
Right.
What's it like there right now, really?
You're right. It doesn't just change like that. French is so embedded in everything in Mali, government, laws, businesses. It's imagine you're trying to rebuild the foundation of your house, but you're still living in it.
Right.
That's what it's like. It takes a ton of time, planning, and resources.
So French is still around, but it's not the official language. Instead, they've got 13 national languages now that are official, like Bambara, Songhay, Peul, and Tamashek. What's that going to mean for the average person in Mali?
That's where it gets really, really cool. Imagine if you grew up and you were taught in your own language.
Right.
You could be part of the government using the language you already know.
Wow.
This change could be incredibly empowering for a lot of Malians. It's finally they're recognizing this heritage, and it's rejecting this idea that French is somehow the only way.
It makes me wonder about the money side of things, Switching languages can't be cheap.
Right.
Any idea what the cost might be, or even if there are benefits?
You've hit a really important point. Of course it's going to cost money. Translating, new materials for schools, training officials. But some experts are saying that embracing these national languages could actually help the economy in the long run.
Really?
Think about it. If local communication is stronger, then trade within Mali could increase.
Right.
And communities who were left out before because they didn't speak French, they could now participate more.
That's a really interesting way to look at it. So this language thing could impact their whole society, really. But we have to remember, Mali's got other things going on, too. I mean, security threats, right?
Unfortunately, yeah. Terrorist groups in the Sahel region have been a huge problem for Mali for years. We got to look back at what happened in 2011 in Libya with Gaddafi. When his regime collapsed, it led to a ton of weapons and fighters moving across borders, and that made things way worse for Mali.
It's a reminder that what happens in one place can really impact another.
Right.
So how did all this affect Mali's relationship with France, especially with their colonial history?
Well, France got involved militarily back in 2013 with something called Operation Serval. The idea was to fight terrorism and get things stable again.
Okay.
Later, they had Operation Barkhane, which was a bigger counterterrorism thing. But even though France said they wanted to help, it became a huge controversy.
I can see why. What did people in Mali think? Did they feel like France was pushing too far?
Exactly. Many people felt that France wasn't really effective in actually stopping terrorism.
Right.
And some even thought they were making things worse. A lot of people felt like France was just looking out for themselves, not really for Mali. That's where you get the term neocolonialism.
Okay.
It's the idea that, even though a country is independent, these former colonial powers are still trying to control them.
So it wasn't just about the military, it was about history and who has the power.
Absolutely. And this anti-French feeling eventually led to a big change in their government.
Oh, here's where it gets interesting. What happened?
In 2020, people were getting more and more frustrated, with the security problems and with France, and the government got overthrown.
Wow.
This new leadership, they wanted to get away from the West, especially France. That was a huge turning point for Mali and led to some interesting new partnerships.
Partnerships that probably surprised a lot of people. So who did Mali turn to?
Here's where the Wagner Group comes in. They're this Russian private military company, and they've been involved in, let's just say, a lot of controversial stuff around the world.
Yeah, they're not exactly known for being peaceful. What are they doing in Mali, and what did France think about all this?
The Wagner Group is pretty secretive, but they're probably training the Malian army and helping them fight. France saw this as a direct threat to their influence. They condemned Mali for working with Wagner. So this pushed Mali further from the West and closer to Russia.
So it was like a tug of war with Mali in the middle.
Exactly.
And then on top of everything else, there were economic sanctions.
Yeah, in 2022, ECOWAS, that's the Economic Community of West African States, they put sanctions on Mali. It was because of the two, and because the government wasn't moving back to civilian rule fast enough.
Okay.
These sanctions were supposed to isolate Mali, cut them off from trade and banking.
So they were trying to force Mali's hand, but it seems like those sanctions didn't quite go as planned.
You're right. ECOWAS wanted to weaken Mali's government, but in some ways it had the opposite effect. It made people feel more united, more resilient. Mali started focusing on doing things locally, trading more within Africa, and finding new partners outside of ECOWAS.
Like they were saying, we'll do it our own way.
Exactly. They're finding their own path, linguistically and politically.
It seems like this desire to be independent ties into something even bigger, like a movement to reclaim their culture.
Absolutely. And that's what we're seeing in Mali. This push to reclaim their cultural identity and redefine themselves in the world.
And that's where the language shift becomes part of this much bigger transformation, right? Mm-hmm. It's about more than just words. Right. It's about like decolonizing their whole way of thinking, bringing back their cultural heritage, and embracing who they are.
You got it. This linguistic revolution is just one part of this much larger movement towards self-determination. They're taking back their language, but it's also about taking back their whole story.
And that's where things get really, really interesting. What parts of their culture are they trying to bring back? How is this going to change their whole society? But before we get into that, we need to take a quick break.
Okay.
We'll be back soon to explore this cultural renaissance that's happening in Mali and what it means for the rest of Africa and, well, maybe even the whole world. Stick around.
We're back, and before the break, we were talking about how Mali is moving away from French.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And it's part of this bigger effort to, kind of reclaim their story, their culture.
Yeah. I'm
curious about the details, like how is this actually showing up? Not just the language, but like in everyday life.
One thing that's really noticeable is traditional clothing is making a comeback.
Oh, interesting. People are wearing like traditional Malayan fabrics and designs more and more.
Yeah.
Even in everyday life. It's like a statement, Yeah,
like we have our own style. We don't need to follow Western trends.
Exactly. And it's not just about how it looks. These traditional clothes have a deeper meaning, like a connection to their history.
Right.
Like Bogolan fabric. Have you heard of that?
I don't think so.
It's this mud-dyed cloth with these beautiful patterns.
Wow.
It's become a symbol of being Malian.
Yeah, that's cool.
People of all ages are wearing it. It's really great to see.
So fashion is like a language in itself. It's a way to show your culture, your values.
Absolutely. What about music?
Oh, right.
That's another area where you see this cultural revival happening. Malian music has always been, amazing.
Right.
But now there's this renewed focus on traditional instruments and styles.
I see.
Take the kora, for example.
Yeah.
It's this 21-string harp lute.
Wow, 21 strings.
Yeah. And it's having a revival.
Yeah.
People are using it in modern music, but they're still honoring the traditional ways.
It's like they're blending the old and the new.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. It challenges this idea that tradition and modern stuff can't exist together.
Right. You can be both.
Mali's showing that you can have both.
Yeah.
You can be proud of your heritage and still move forward.
It's like saying we can be modern and Malian at the same time.
Exactly.
It brings us back to what we talked about earlier, recognizing and valuing traditional knowledge. Like, what are some things that Mali has that might have been overlooked or dismissed before?
Traditional medicine is a perfect example. Malians have been using herbs and traditional healing for, centuries.
Makes sense.
But during colonial times, this knowledge was often seen as, primitive or unscientific.
It's like they were trying to say, our way is the only right way.
Yeah. But what's exciting is that now people are rediscovering these traditional knowledge systems.
I see.
Like in Mali, there's a growing interest in herbal medicine again. People are realizing it works, and it's part of their culture. They're even working to document it, to preserve it for the future.
It's like they're saying, our ancestors knew things, they had solutions, and we can learn from them.
Yeah. This is happening in other areas too, like agriculture. Mali has a long history of sustainable farming,
Okay.
techniques that work for their climate and their land. But these practices were often ignored in favor of, Western agricultural methods.
Right.
And those methods weren't always the best fit.
So they're realizing that they don't always need outside solutions.
Amazing.
They have their own ways that have worked for generations.
Right. They're not starting from scratch. They have centuries of knowledge to draw on. And this is where language comes in.
Oh, okay.
Language isn't just about talking. It's how we carry knowledge. When you lose a language, you lose a way of seeing the world, understanding things, being.
So when Malians are bringing back their languages, they're bringing back those ways of knowing, those unique perspectives.
Absolutely. It's about decolonizing the mind.
Interesting.
It's like breaking free from this idea that your language, your culture, your knowledge are somehow less than others.
It's about valuing different perspectives.
Exactly. And this makes me think about South Africa.
Okay.
They have 11 official languages in their constitution.
Wow, that's a lot.
Could they be an example for Mali? As they're going through this big language change, I think South Africa has a lot to teach us, both the good and the bad, about having multiple languages.
Okay.
They've shown that it is possible to have a society that embraces all these different languages and still be united.
Wow.
But it hasn't been easy for them.
What kind of problems have they had?
One of the biggest challenges is making sure all the languages are treated equally,
Right.
And that there's enough resources for all of them. It's a constant balancing act. And some people say that certain languages, especially those spoken by fewer people, haven't gotten enough support.
So it's not enough to just say a language is official. You have to put in the work, the resources.
Absolutely. And that's something Mali will need to think about,
Yeah.
as they go forward with this.
Yeah.
They need to make sure all 13 languages are equal.
Right.
That there's money for education, translation,
Right.
and that people can actually use their language in everyday life. It's a huge job.
Yeah.
But it could really change their society, their culture, their future.
It's a massive undertaking, but also such an exciting time for them. Mali is leading this movement that's happening all across Africa.
Right.
It's about reclaiming their languages and their culture.
Yeah.
And this brings up another interesting point.
Okay.
This idea of a pan-African language.
Right.
Like a language that could unite the whole continent.
Yep.
We talked about Swahili a bit earlier, but I think it's worth exploring more. What are the pros and cons of Swahili becoming this unifying language?
The idea is really interesting, right?
Yeah.
Imagine a whole continent where people from different countries, backgrounds, cultures can easily understand each other.
It's like a dream almost.
It could bring people together, boost trade, make collaboration easier, and really strengthen this sense of shared African identity. Swahili is already spoken by over 100 million people,
Wow.
mostly in East and Central Africa. So it's seen as a possible candidate.
It's a fascinating idea, but I imagine not everyone is thrilled about it.
You're right. Some people have concerns. It's natural. Some might worry that promoting one language could harm others,
Yeah.
Like the smaller languages might get pushed aside or even disappear.
So it's about finding that balance, unity and diversity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's not a simple choice, It's about understanding the complexities and finding ways to honor both. The desire to be united and the need to protect all these different languages and cultures.
It sounds like a really complicated discussion.
It is, and it's one that's just starting.
It'll be interesting to see how things develop. But what Mali has shown us is that language is about more than just words. It's about power, identity, and having the right to decide for yourself.
Absolutely. Language is at the core of who we are as individuals and as communities. And the choices we make about language, they affect our societies and cultures in big ways.
Mali's decision has started this wave of discussions across Africa. People are thinking about these things, debating them.
Right.
It'll be fascinating to see how this linguistic revolution plays out. And with that, we're going to take another quick break. We'll be right back to talk about what Mali's decision means for the rest of the world and what it says about the future of Africa. Stay with us. We're back, and we've been talking about this whole linguistic revolution in Mali.
Right.
And it's so much more than just words on paper, right? It's about like shifting power, taking control, and really challenging this whole system that often ignores African languages.
It's really interesting how this connects to what's happening globally.
Yeah.
All these discussions about decolonization.
Right.
It's not just Mali. A lot of former colonies are dealing with this legacy of linguistic imperialism.
Can you explain that a bit more? Like, what does that actually look like, in real life?
It's like the language of the colonizer becomes the language of power.
Right.
It's seen as better or necessary to get ahead.
Okay.
And you see it in subtle ways, like job requirements.
Okay.
They demand fluency in a European language, even when it's not really needed for the job.
So it creates a barrier for people.
Exactly.
If they haven't had the same education or if their language isn't valued, they're at a disadvantage.
Exactly. And it reinforces this idea that knowledge and power belong to those who speak the dominant language. And this is where organizations like La Francophonie come in.
Right. We talked about them before, but they're a big part of this, aren't they? For those who might not know, it's this organization of French-speaking countries.
Right.
It's supposed to be about cooperation and culture, but how does that connect to this idea of linguistic imperialism?
Well, some people say that even though La Francophonie talks about diversity, they're actually just keeping French dominant.
Yes.
They say that French is always prioritized in schools, in government,
Okay.
and that it can actually hold back African languages from developing and being used.
So it's like, if you want to be part of the world, if you want to be successful, you have to do it in French.
Yeah, and that can make people who haven't mastered French feel like they're not good enough.
Right.
Like their own knowledge and culture aren't as important.
So when Mali makes their national languages official, it's like a direct challenge to that.
Exactly.
It's saying our languages matter, our voices matter, our stories matter.
Yes. And it's having an impact beyond Mali. Across Africa, there's this growing movement for linguistic diversity. People are pushing for change in education, bringing back traditional knowledge, and showing that indigenous languages are valuable.
It's like Mali has opened the door for others to say, we have the right to be ourselves, to speak our own languages.
Exactly. And it reminds us that language is more than just communication. It's about who you are, your culture, your right to tell your own story. And when that right has been taken away, reclaiming your language is a powerful act.
What do you think the future holds for multilingualism in Africa? Could we see colonial languages become less dominant? Could we have a more equal linguistic landscape?
It's definitely possible. As more people embrace their own languages and demand their rightful place in society, in education, government, everywhere, we could see a real transformation. But it won't be easy. There are a lot of deeply rooted structures and power dynamics to overcome.
Right, and even if Swahili became more widely used as a unifying language, like we talked about before, there would still be this need to protect all the other languages and cultures.
Exactly. It's a complex situation.
But Mali has shown that change can happen.
Absolutely.
It starts with recognizing the problem, challenging the way things are, and valuing what's been ignored for so long. It's about decolonizing not just institutions, but our minds as well. So as we wrap up this deep dive into what's happening in Mali, we're left with more than just facts and figures.
Yeah.
We're left with the sense of possibility.
Right.
We can imagine a future where Africa's rich mix of languages is celebrated, not held back by the past.
Absolutely.
And it leaves us with some things to think about,
Yeah.
For you listening, what role does language play in your life?
Right.
How does it shape who you are, your connection to your heritage?
Yeah.
And how can we all help create a world where linguistic diversity is valued and everyone has a chance to be heard?
Because this isn't just about Mali.
Right.
It's about the power of language, how it shapes our world. And we all have a responsibility to use that power in a good way, in a fair way.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious.